Hey there, and welcome to Child Development Week 9. This week, we will be discussing cognitive development in early childhood. You will be reading Papalia Chapter 10 for your base reading. You'll also be doing 2 additional readings. One is in the Galvana Cole book and is titled The Credible Shrinking Room. The other is an article that is provided on Blackboard. For this week, as you'll see in the assignments folder, there is a mini quiz and a project-based assessment. The mini quiz is 10 fill-in-the-blank questions. They are very easy and should be very simple for you to complete, particularly if you do it right after you do the reading. It should take you maybe 5 to 8 minutes to complete that quiz. The project-based assessment will take a little bit more time. There are 2 options for the assessment, as you can see looking in the other folder, that one requires you either to watch some cartoons or to have access to 2 children ages 3 to 7. So whichever one of those works better for you or whichever one you prefer. They both have slightly different goals and purposes, but they're both related back to the chapter, and I think you'll enjoy doing those project-based assessments, or at least I hope you do. Talking about the pre-operational child, which is the stage name that Piaget gave to children who are in that stage of cognitive development where they're not really ready yet to engage in those logical, orderly mental thought processes and operations, but at the same time, they're not at the same stage as infant looking at sensory motor operations. They're kind of in a middle stage. We do see within this stage, there's a great expansion of the use of symbolic thought, or the ability for children to use things to represent other things, which is kind of how we know that children are transitioning into this pre-operational stage. The idea of symbolic function is really just Piaget's term for children's ability to do just that, to use mental representations, whether it's words or images, to which a child has attached some sort of meaning. You may see that through pretend play or deferred imitation, being able to imitate something that they've seen another child or an adult do. Even in their language, being able to use language appropriately is an example of symbolic function. Within this pre-operational stage, we see that children still have difficulty understanding causality, and they don't really know what causes a certain event to happen. So there's this idea of transduction, being that they mentally link these 2 events. Whether or not there's really a logical causal relationship, they don't understand that part yet, but they mentally link those 2 events. So a child may think that their bad behavior caused their friend to trip and fall during a game. They may think that their bad thoughts caused their parents to get a divorce. There's not a logical link between the 2, but because children don't really understand all the ins and outs, nuances of potential causality, they kind of transduce that this particular action or thought that they had or emitted then led to whatever this other circumstance was. Understanding identities and categorization. As children are growing older, we're talking kind of the preschool age right now, they definitely have a better understanding of the idea of identities. So the concept that people and things are basically the same, even if they change in form, size, or appearance. So my dad one day may have really long hair and a beard, and the next day he may have gotten his hair cut and may have shaved off his beard. He looks different, but he's still my dad. I still can understand that at the preschool, at the pre-operational age. We know that infants and toddlers have a much difficult time dealing with that because they haven't cognitively advanced to that idea of being able to keep and maintain the idea of identities. Animism is the tendency to attribute life to objects that are not alive. So animating those inanimate objects. This was one of the things that Piaget talked a lot about, and he just felt that children in this pre-operational stage, so mostly 3 and 4-year-olds, didn't understand what was really alive and what wasn't alive. In one of his studies, he asked children whether the wind and the clouds were alive. And based on their answers, he believed really that they were confused about what it means to be alive and what it means to be not alive. However, more recently, other researchers have looked at asking children similar types of questions about things that are more familiar to them. These researchers thought that maybe the wind and clouds were a little bit too abstract for children to deal with, but talking to them about dolls and rocks and things that they have more experience, with in their environment, they would be able to talk about more relatively whether or not they were alive or not alive. And they did find that children had a good understanding, even as 3 and 4-year-olds, that they knew that dolls can't move on their own because dolls were not alive. So this evidence suggests that maybe Piaget's ideas about animism were a little limited based on the way he did the research in that area. The idea of understanding numbers is definitely more concrete and continuing to develop as students are in that pre-operational, or children are in that pre-operational stage. So the idea of ordinality, so that's really comparing quantities. Is this more or is this less? Is this bigger or is this smaller? You show a child 2 cookies and ask them which cookie they want. They're going to pick the bigger cookie. If you show a child different piles of coins and ask them which coins they want, they're going to want the one that has more. That's one of those funny tricks. If you offer a child $1 versus offering them 10 pennies, they're going to take the 10 pennies at this point in time because they don't understand yet that $1 is worth more. All they see there is the quantity piece. You have 1 piece of money versus 10 pieces of money. So they're going to take that 10 pieces of money because they want the more. The cardinality principle is the idea of what that cardinal number is. So often children younger than the pre-operational stage, so still in that sensory motor stage, will recite those number names. So if you show them 5 coins, they're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But when you ask them to tell you how many are there altogether, they're not going to be able to do that. They're going to just go back and count those numbers instead of being able to say to you, there are 5 coins. So cardinality starts to develop and grow in children in that pre-operational stage. We see them being able to, after counting, sometimes even before counting out loud, be able to tell us how many are in that particular quantity or in that pile of coins or whatever it is that they are counting. Overall number sense continues to develop through this pre-operational stage as they are participating potentially in preschool or daycare programs or in engaging in activities through different learning games, maybe with parents or older siblings. And for the most part, their basic number sense has developed by the time they enter elementary school. That includes being able to count, being able to have an understanding of number knowledge, which is that idea of ordinality that we just talked about, number transformations, so simple addition and subtraction, knowing if I add something that I have more, if I take away something that I have less, being able to estimate, so without counting, being able to estimate whether or not something is more or less, and the recognition of number patterns, knowing that 2 plus 2 will equal 4 and 3 plus 1 also equals 4. Typically, those areas are developed or at least starting to emerge by the time a student enters kindergarten. Immature aspects of pre-operational thought. So we definitely see that children are more developed cognitively and more advanced in that sensory motor stage. However, there are definitely still some immature aspects and some places where they're continuing to develop. One of the main places we see this is with the idea of centration versus decentration. One of the main characteristics of the pre-operational thought is that children are very centric in their thinking. They tend to focus only on one aspect of a situation and neglect the other aspects. Often it is their own aspect that they can see and not the aspect or the opinions or perspectives of others. So a lot of times preschoolers, when presented with a certain problem or test, they'll have illogical conclusions because they are not able to decenter. So take themselves away and put themselves in someone else's shoes, so to speak, to think about the different aspects of a situation all at the same time. The idea of egocentrism is that idea of focusing on themselves and not being able to take another person's perspective has been studied through the 3 mountain task, which was Piaget's original task, where a child sat on one side of 3 mountains and a doll was placed on the other side, and the child was then asked to identify what their perspective was of those mountains, and then to identify what the doll's perspective was of those mountains. Usually they couldn't answer what the doll's perspective was, and they would describe the mountains from their own perspective. Piaget then said that this was evidence that children can't imagine someone else's point of view because they haven't developed that cognitive ability yet. However, as with some of the past experiments that we've seen, some other researchers came along and said, Piaget, we feel like you're using weird tasks again. This mountain and doll thing is not necessarily something that children are going to have previous experience with. It's going to be an awkward task for them. So they set up a different task, and we're just going to call it the police officer task. In this task, the child was seated in front of a square board, and there were walls that were divided into 4 sections. There was a toy police officer at the edge of a board, and a doll was moved from one section to another. And after he was placed in each section, the children were asked, can the police officer see the doll? Then another toy police officer was brought into the action, and the child was told to hide the doll from both officers. These tasks require then the child to be able to take the perspective of the police officer to determine in the first task whether or not the police officer can see the doll, and in the second task to make sure that both police officers can't see the doll. Children between the ages of 3.5 and 5 were correct 90% of the time, which suggests that, similarly to some of the past experiments we've seen and some of the past ideas of Piaget, that when given a test situation that is more naturalistic and involves items or situations that children may have engaged in this particular example, being able to hide and play with the idea of hiding from the police was more familiar to these children, and they were able to demonstrate that they could decenter and see things from a different perspective. The ideas and the immature aspects of conservation are definitely one that continues to be a limited aspect for children in this particular stage. So the conservation task, the idea that when you show a child 2 cups of water or juice that are the same size and equally filled, that they will be able to state that there is an equal amount of juice in both cups. Then you take a cup that is taller and thinner, and you pour juice from one cup into that taller, thinner cup, and then ask this child again, which cup has more juice. The child is going to pick one of the 2 and then say it's either this one because it's taller or it's that one because it's wider. They don't have an understanding that the amount of juice has stayed the same and just the container is something it's bigger or different. They also tend to focus on successive states, so they don't recognize transformation from one state to another. So in the experiment that we just talked about, they don't really recognize that the water in each glass is the same, and that as it's being poured from one glass to another, it's still that same water. So they fail to realize that the amount of water is the same. In their mind, it's the same as if they were never shown those first 2 glasses with equal juice, and then they were shown just the 2 juice glasses, one tall and thin, the other short and wide, and asked which one has more juice in it. They can't retain the memory of that initial state that they saw that juice in. Theory of mind is simply the awareness and understanding of mental process. So the idea of being able to understand that there's a mental thought process and being aware that there is a thought process in that way. People wanted to know, do children have theories of mind? And so looking at thinking in mental states, the idea of social cognition, we really see by age 3 that social cognition is able to be demonstrated. the idea that other people have mental states, and that those mental states aren't the same as ours necessarily. We often see this in empathy being shown by children. So if another child is upset about something, or if mommy or daddy is sick, the child is empathetic. They're not sick. They don't feel bad, but they can recognize that someone else feels bad for a reason, and they want to try to help make them feel better. The idea of false beliefs and deception, really what we see in research is that the idea is that deception can appear around age 2, but by age 5, there's some understanding of the role of intent. So within this, a typical research study will present a familiar container. So let's say it's a Play-Doh, a jar of Play-Doh, and ask the child, what do you think is in this jar? The child is going to answer, it has Play-Doh in it. And then if we say, what do you think mommy will think is in this jar? The child is going to tell us, mommy is going to think that there's Play-Doh in the jar. So we open the jar and dump out the contents, and inside are buttons. So then we ask the child, what was in the jar? And she says, buttons. And then we say, what do you think mommy will think is in the jar? And she says, buttons. And then we put the buttons back in the jar and we close it up and we say, so what did you think was in the jar before you opened it? And she'll say, buttons. Children don't understand that, there's been a deception, that other people will still be deceived the way that they have been deceived. Once they know kind of what that deception was, they think that other people will not be fooled. And so they're not able to logically think that out. But because it's a deliberate effort to look at a false belief in somebody else's mind, children have to suppress the impulse to be truthful, which they do have at a very early age. Being able to distinguish between appearance and reality. This is the idea that just because something appears to be one way doesn't mean that it's really that way. Some of the classic studies in this looked at showing children a container of milk that was, it's just regular milk, it's a white color, and then they put on special glasses that make the milk appear to be a different color. And they said that the milk was that color, even though they had just seen that the milk was white. They're not able to distinguish between those things. Their perception, particularly with appearance, is reality for them during this pre-operational stage. Being able to distinguish between fantasy and reality is another area in which children show that they have kind of a theory of mind, and that they can seem to understand the difference between a real dog and a dog in a dream versus something imaginary or versus something invisible. They can pretend, they can tell when someone else is pretending, but sometimes they continue to engage in those pretend activities or those fantasy activities, not because they're confused, but just because they're using that as a way to explain things that don't have an obvious realistic explanation, simply because they lack the knowledge to understand what really happened. The research from this idea actually suggests that young children have a better picture of reality than what Piaget initially thought, based on his original research. The book goes on to talk about some influences of individual differences in theory of mind, infant social attention, so the idea of how much social attention infants demonstrated predicted later theory of mind, which suggests that may be linked to social cognition and to cognitive ability in general. Social competence and language development, suggesting that the more socially competent and the quicker language develops, we see more developed theories of mind at early age. And then families that encourage pretend play, so being able to think from someone else's perspective or to think in a different way that is not your own, also encourages a theory of mind. Research in this area in the last several years has looked particularly at theory of mind and its relation to children with autism. And the research at this point really suggests that children with autism do not employ a theory of mind, that they have particular difficulties with tasks that require them to be able to decenter and to take on another person's mental or emotional state of mind, that they really struggle with that, and suggest that they do not have or employ a theory of mind. The information processing approach of memory development really looks at the memories and how we retain them and how we retrieve them and the different types of memory, and they focus on that piece. Within this, some of the basic terms that you should be familiar with, the processes of memory development, encoding being the idea, which exactly what it sounds like, is just preparing information for long-term storage and retrieval. Storage is the retention of information for future use, and then retrieval is accessing the information or recalling the information from that memory storage. So that's the basic process of how memories are made and stored and retrieved. There are three different types of memory discussed in the book. Sensory memory, which is a temporary storehouse. It's not a permanent memory, but it's really your incoming sensory input. There's little change in that from infancy. And without the processing, those sensory memories fade, but it is remembering what different types of sensory inputs are. Working memory is short-term storage of information, things that are being actively processed. Within that, there's two different main functions. There's the executive function, which is your conscious control of thoughts and emotions, that you're doing something with the intent to solve a problem or a goal, that you're looking for a solution, and it's a conscious effort. Then there's the central executive, which is the working memory that controls the processing of information. So the central executive is something that is more of a subconscious process that we're not in control of in a conscious way. Long-term memory is storage of virtually, scientists believe, unlimited capacity that holds information for long periods or long times. Recognition and recall. Recognition is just the ability to identify something that you've encountered before, so being able to pick something out. Recall is the ability to reproduce knowledge from memory, so being able to provide somebody a description of something. Forming early childhood memories. There are three basic types of early childhood memories that are recognized within the book. Generic memories are those memories that kind of produce a script or a schema, just a general outline of a repeated event. So washing your hands, that's a generic memory. You probably don't remember the exact moment you first learned to wash your hands, but you remember the script of washing your hands because it's something that was repeated over and over and over again, so you know the general expectation for a situation where you're supposed to wash your hands. Episodic memory is the awareness of a specific particular event that occurred at a specific time and place. So often that's memories or events that are new to a child. And episodic memories tend to be temporary as well because younger children have a limited memory capacity, unless that's something that occurs several times, in which it becomes a generic memory. But an episodic memory is remembering of a specific certain place and time, but that eventually also fades. Autobiographical memories are specific episodic memories that are distinct experiences from your life history. So those things for you that are maybe more unique because of the way they happened. So maybe you don't remember the first time you learned to wash your hands or the first time you washed your hands by yourself, but maybe you do remember a particularly funny time from your childhood where you washed your hands and ended up making a big bubble mess in the sink because you used too much soap, and you remember your mom coming in and playing with you in the bubbles even though you had made a mess. That would be an autobiographical memory. It was a specific, distinct experience that happened in your life history. Things that can influence your memory retention. The repetitive conversational style is the idea that the conversation is something that is repeated over and over. So when a question is asked, you're simply repeating part of what the question is. What we've seen in research is that often this will be a parent asking, do you remember how we did this? Do you remember how we did that? Do you remember that we rode the train? Do you remember that we went to this place? The expectation there is the child will answer yes. There's not a lot of elaborating going on with that. But the elaborative style of conversation elicits more information. So a parent might ask, do you remember when we went to Florida? The child may say yes. Did we go by a car or by a plane? And it's asking, producing opportunities for children to share more information with that particular style of interaction. The shared memory, the role of culture, there's definitely cultural differences in conversational styles that may be impacting children's memory retention just based on their culture alone. Some cultures are more likely to use a repetitive conversational style, where other cultures are more likely to really use that elaborate conversational style. The last section of the book talks about psychometric and Vygotskian approaches to intelligence. So traditional psychometric measures look overall at a child's verbal skills and their nonverbal skills, and they typically will combine those skills into an overall fluid intelligence quotient. For this particular age group during the preoperational stage, so ages typically 3 to 7, there are two main tests that are used to measure the IQ of a child in that age, and that's the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale and the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, which is called the WIPSI. Both of those tests involve standardized set of directions and a variety of different sub-tests that children engage in that measure things like their working memory, their quantitative reasoning, their visual spatial processing, both through verbal and nonverbal tasks. Influence on measured intelligence, we know from years of research that genetics, family environment, SES, all impact measured intelligence. One of the common misconceptions of IQ scores, both within the world of education and within the world of psychology, is that an IQ score represents a fixed number, a fixed quantity of the inborn intelligence of that person. What we know is that IQ is really just a measure of how well that child can do those tasks on a certain day and a certain time in comparison with other children who have also completed those tasks. We do know that over time, intelligence and intelligence quotients, as they are currently measured, do tend to remain fairly stable. However, engaging in tasks that are similar to the tasks or tasks that demand greater cognitive ability can change the results of someone's IQ scores. Testing and teaching based on Vygotsky's theory, Vygotsky really felt that that intelligence and cognitive ability was something that wasn't a static measurement, but that should be a fluid measurement that should look at what a child can do on their own and what they're not quite ready to do without a little bit of help. And that's the idea behind zones of proximal development. And that zone of proximal development is talking about that skill level between what a child can do and what they can't quite do by themselves. So with the idea of scaffolding, which is just, adding temporary support, a little help here and there, the child can accomplish those things that they can't do on their own. So within Vygotsky's theory, teaching then would take what a child can do on their own, it would use scaffolding to help them do what they can't do on their own, and over time, the pieces of that scaffolding would be removed so that eventually the child could do that task on their own, and then the next task would be added with that scaffolding. The idea of language development. Vocabulary, we know that is something that continues to grow exponentially throughout childhood. At age 3, children can use about 1,000 words. By age 6, their expressive vocabulary, so what they can say, the words they can use, is about 2,600 words, but they understand more than 20,000 words. So we do see, again, the development of that language, that the comprehension or understanding of spoken language develops much more quickly than the expressive or active speech patterns within that spoken language. With the help of schooling, the active and passive vocabulary continues to grow. One of the reasons or the ideas behind why this happens is the idea of fast mapping, which is the idea that a child can pick up the meaning of a new word after hearing it only once or twice in a conversation or in context. So the idea that they can kind of learn from the context a general basic idea of what the meaning is for that word, and then they start to use that word within their own conversations. Grammar and syntax, being able to produce grammatically correct statements and to string those statements, ideas into correct sentences. Children at this age, the pre-operational stage, don't know the specific rules. They overgeneralize those new rules when they're learned. So the comprehension is often a little immature. However, once they get to the point where they're in a school setting, these are some of the things, grammar and syntax, that are specifically taught to students, and they are not necessarily expected to learn those things just by being in their environment. The same thing with pragmatics and social and private speech. Pragmatics is the idea of using language to communicate. So it's pragmatic language is the language of communication. Most children do pick up on pragmatics through the interactions with other children their same age and with adults. However, there is a portion of children that need and benefit from specific instruction in this area. In particular, students with autism and students with developmental delays often struggle with pragmatic speech. Social speech is speech intended to be understood by someone, whereas private speech in comparison is the idea of speech that is meant for yourself alone and is not intended to communicate to someone else. So in other words, kind of talking out loud to yourself, which is something that a lot of pre-operational children engage in, and a lot of adults, if they're honest with themselves, continue to engage in as well. Delayed language development is not uncommon in children during this pre-operational stage. We know that about 5 to 8% of preschool children will show speech and language delays. This could be because there's problems with their fast mapping. They may need to hear those new words more often than other children in order to be able to incorporate the use of those new words into their own vocabulary. What we do know is that 80% of children with language delays at age 2 will catch up with their other children by age 7, and then the resulting leftover children who continue to have those delays may benefit from specific speech and language therapy in order to target their specific needs, whether they're pragmatic, whether they relate more to articulation or to comprehending expressive speech. Preparation for literacy. Emergent literacy is just the development of those pre-reading skills. So the pre-reading skills that we see in preschoolers during this pre-operational stage is phonemic awareness, so the understanding that letters have certain sounds and that sounds blend together in certain ways. And then the phoneme grapheme correspondence just furthers out that idea that there are letters and sounds and combinations of those things that make those specific phonics sounds. Early childhood education is something that continues to be a major media focus and a major focus for national education panels moving forward, as we are constantly looking at the ideas of, on a global level, how do our kindergartners compare with kindergartners of other nationalities? How do our 10th graders and our 9th graders and our seniors compare academically? And so as we look at the global level, I believe that childhood education, and specifically early childhood education, will continue to be more and more impacted by those changes and may implement more of the ideas from a global level of what early childhood education should look like. However, currently, preschools are one of two types. They are either child-initiated, which is more looking at letting the child be creative and kind of letting the child control what they engage in, whether it's cognitive or emotional or social interactive opportunities, or they are academically directed. So looking more at specific curriculum and specific cognitive tasks. And then there are some preschools who are middle of the road who really encompass ideas from both the child-initiated and the academically directed. You should be familiar with both the Montessori method and the Reggio Emilia approach and be able to compare those two approaches and talk about what is different about the Reggio Emilia approach, which does take a little bit of its background and focus from the Montessori method. Compensatory preschool programs really started in the 60s, large-scale programs looking at giving children pre-compensation, if you will, for what they have missed. So taking children from low SES neighborhoods or children who may have had other difficulties in their preschool, their toddler ages, and then giving them a Head Start. So Project Head Start is probably the most well-known federally funded program of this sort of a compensatory preschool program. Was started in 1965, and it looks at a whole child approach. So it has goals not just to enhance cognitive skills, but to improve physical health, to foster self-confidence and social skills. The program also looks at medical, dental, mental health care, social services, and provides services and supports to parents in the form of parent training in hopes that by training the parents, there may be less of a need for as many children to participate in those types of programs in the future. Data that's collected nationally by the agency does continue to support the implementation of the Head Start program. It does show that children who attend those programs show better cognitive and language skills, and they do better in children that have not attended those types of programs. Those children who have participated in Project Head Start or programs like Head Start are less likely to be placed in special education services. They're less likely to repeat a grade level, more likely to finish high school than their counterparts who did not participate in a similar type program. Children in kindergarten, and the concept of kindergarten has really changed a lot over the last several years. Originally, kindergarten was kind of seen as a transitional time between the relative freedom from home or potentially a preschool or a daycare to the more structure of a grade school. However, kindergarten in the United States in recent years has become more like first grade. There's less self-chosen activities, and there's more time on worksheets preparing children to read and cognitive tasks than there have been in the past. The emotional and social adjustment of children entering kindergarten is still a big impact on whether or not it's appropriate for a child to start kindergarten. It strongly predicts school success. So oftentimes, working in a school district, we are faced with children who the parent wants them to start kindergarten, but they do not meet the age deadline. In the particular district where I work, if you are not 5 by October 1st, you are not eligible to participate in kindergarten. However, because of the way the state laws are set up, we do have to offer the option of early entrance into kindergarten for those students who demonstrate that they are advanced or accelerated, and that they, even though they are not 5, need that level of education. For our district, the testing, the process that is involved for that early entrance into kindergarten is two-pronged. The first piece of which is the academic readiness piece in looking at the child's intelligence. And that child who is typically 4, they typically would turn 5 sometime in, October, November, or December. The testing is done in April or May. So we're talking about a child who is 4 and still a good 6 to 8 months from being 5. That child completes an intelligence test, and during the intelligence test, we are also asked to just make anecdotal records of the child's behavior during the testing session, whether or not the child was able to follow directions, how long they were able to test before they needed a break, were they able to sit still, were they able to wait their turn. And then we provide information back to the school district on both their cognitive abilities as well as what we see as the behavioral readiness for that social adjustment piece of kindergarten. And then that information is taken into consideration as to whether or not a student has that early entrance. Unfortunately, more often than not, some of the social emotional adjustment recommendations aren't seen as important as that IQ score, and it has happened in the past where we have had students who tested as advanced and they achieved the IQ score that they needed for early entrance, though their behavioral observations suggested that kindergarten would not be appropriate at that time. They were still allowed to start kindergarten, and they did struggle with the social and emotional adjustment during their kindergarten year. So it's just something to keep in mind that while a child may be cognitively ready for the demands of kindergarten, are they socially and emotionally ready for what those demands are going to be as well? Both of those things should be taken into heavy consideration, particularly if you have a child who is turning 5 right before school. So those children who are summer birthdays, June, July, August. Just because a child meets that 5-year-old deadline to start kindergarten doesn't necessarily mean that starting kindergarten when they're 5 is going to be what's most appropriate for them. As a matter of fact, we have seen a recent change in the last 8 years within the district where I work of more parents choosing to keep their child in preschool for that additional year when they are 5 and have them start kindergarten as 6-year-olds. Don't know if that's a national trend or just something we're seeing more locally, but that is something that I have observed. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this week there will be a mini quiz and a project-based assessment that you will be completing. So these objectives are really linked back to the big ideas that you should be taking away from this chapter and the things that you should keep in mind when it comes time to studying for the final. From this chapter, you should be able to summarize the findings related to preschoolers' understanding of numbers. So the cardinality and ordinality and those sorts of things that preschoolers typically will come into kindergarten already having established. You should be able to describe the idea of centration and talk about how children's perspectives are limited. You should be able to talk from that same idea about Piaget's original ideas of egocentrism and the more recent research that has been done and how those two things are different. Explain why pre-operational children have difficulty with the concept of conservation. Name and discuss the 3 basic processes of memory and the 3 storehouses of memory, and be able to talk about those types of memories in early childhood. What are the factors that affect how well a preschool child remembers events? Be able to talk about the 2 commonly used individual IQ tests for preschoolers. Be able to discuss Vygotsky's zones of proximal development. Discuss possible causes and treatments for language delays. Explain how social interaction can promote preparation for literacy, and be able to briefly describe the Montessori and the Reggio Emilia methods of teaching and discuss how those ideas are different. If you're able to just touch briefly on these key points, you should feel prepared for the final.